Good evening. If you're still awake, I want you to lie back, close your eyes, and breathe slowly. Tonight's story isn't about monsters or ghosts, though perhaps it should be. It's about a real man whose body turned into a tomb while he was still alive, a king whose flesh rotted as he ruled a holy city, and whose throne itself, they said, never lost the smell of his death. His name was Baldwin the Fourth, the Leper King of Jerusalem, and his life was not a legend, but a truth written in bone, in blood, and in the slow decay of human pride. So listen carefully, because this story will take you to a world where faith and fear walked hand in hand, and where a boy became a king while his own body betrayed him piece by piece. It began long ago, in the year 1161, when Baldwin was born beneath the burning sky of the Holy Land. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was young then, fragile as glass, surrounded by enemies who waited for the chance to crush it. His father, King Amalric, ruled a city of stone and prayer. His mother, Princess Agnes, was a woman of grace and ambition. No one could have guessed that their golden-haired son would one day be remembered not for power, but for pain. He was bright, sharp, and strong, learning to ride and fight, like every noble boy. But one afternoon, while playing with the other children, his tutor noticed something strange. Baldwin did not flinch when the others struck him. The boy laughed as his arm bled, unaware of pain. The tutor, a scholar named William of Tyre, performed a simple test. He pricked the boy's hand with a pin. No reaction. Again, nothing. And in that terrible silence, he knew what it meant. Baldwin, heir to Jerusalem. They'd had the first signs of leprosy, a disease that in those days was more feared than death itself. It was believed to be the punishment of God, a mark of sin and impurity. Lepers were cast out, forced to wander with bells around their necks so others could flee from them. And yet this boy, born to rule, carried that curse in his blood. When his father died, Baldwin was only 13. Still smooth-faced, still beautiful, he was crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest place in Christendom. The golden crown was set upon a head that already belonged to death. The nobles knelt, pretending not to see what they all feared. The boy's hands trembled slightly. He could not feel the weight of the scepter in his palm, but his voice, when he swore his oath, was strong and clear. That day, a dying child became king of the holiest city on earth. To the south, the great Muslim general Saladin was uniting Egypt and Syria, gathering an army vast enough to drown Jerusalem in its shadow. Against him stood Baldwin, a boy whose fingers were already losing sensation, whose face would soon begin to swell and twist under the disease. But he refused to hide. He refused to let his men see a victim. Instead, he wrapped his hands in leather, covered his decaying skin with steel and cloth, and rode at the head of his army. The knights called him the Child of Courage. The priests whispered that God had chosen him to suffer for the kingdom's sins. Yet on the battlefield, he was more than a symbol. He was a commander. The year was 1177, when Saladin marched toward Jerusalem with 26,000 men. Baldwin had barely 500 knights. Logic said retreat. Reason said surrender. But Baldwin said charge. They rode under the blazing sun, the true cross carried before them, and met Saladin's forces near Montgizard. The Leper King, 16 years old, rode at the front, his hands bleeding beneath the wrappings, his face already stiff from nerve decay. He raised his sword and gave the order to attack. Against all odds, his charge broke Saladin's lines. The Sultan himself barely escaped. When the dust cleared, the sand was soaked with blood, and Jerusalem was safe, saved by a boy who could no longer feel his own flesh. But victory has a price. After Mongisard, the disease advanced with vengeance. His fingers blackened, his face thickened and lost expression. The smell of death began to follow him like a shadow that no perfume could hide. He ruled from behind curtains to spare his courtiers from horror. Yet he never abandoned his duties. He dictated laws when he could no longer hold a pen. He commanded armies when he could no longer stand. He smiled with eyes that could no longer close. Through lips cracked and bleeding, the people whispered that God had placed an angel's soul in a rotting body to remind them of faith. As years passed, Baldwin became more legend than man. They carried him on a litter through the halls of his palace, his limbs bound in silk to keep the skin from tearing. He could not see clearly anymore. Blindness crept over him like twilight. Yet he knew every voice around him, every sound of his kingdom. When Saladin returned with new armies, Baldwin sent his generals to meet them. And when those generals faltered, he rose again from his bed, demanding to lead them himself. Imagine it, a king who could not walk, being carried into battle while his flesh decayed, his armor polished to hide the smell. Soldiers wept when they saw him. Even his enemies spoke of his courage with awe. But disease does not bargain, not even with kings. By the time he was 24, Baldwin was blind, paralyzed, and nearly skeletal. His body had become a cage of pain. Yet his mind remained sharp, relentless. He crowned his young nephew as co-king, trying to secure the kingdom's future. He signed decrees with what remained of his hands. He prayed in the dark, whispering that he had done all he could. And in the spring of that year, his breathing slowed. His heart gave way, and the Leper King finally fell silent. They buried him beneath the church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was said to have risen from the dead. No one dared call him unclean anymore. The nobles wept as the scent of decay filled the air, and they said that for years after his death, the golden throne of Jerusalem still carried his odor, the faint, unending trace of rot that no incense could erase. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that somewhere beneath the stones of that ancient city lies the dust of a man who ruled while dying, who fought while falling apart, who refused to surrender, even when his body did. Baldwin the Fourth, the Leper King, whose flesh betrayed him, but whose spirit did not. His story is not one of horror, but of defiance of a boy who became a ghost while alive, and still kept the crown. Now, close your eyes. The desert wind is rising. The story has only just begun. The night after Baldwin's coronation, the winds over Jerusalem carried the scent of burning oil and incense from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a fragrance that mixed strangely with the quiet dread of a kingdom that already knew its king was dying. He was only a boy, his golden hair still untouched by sickness, but his eyes had already begun to take on that distant, hollow focus of someone who understood that his body would not last long enough for his dreams. The palace physicians whispered that the young monarch's hands were colder than they should be, that his pulse was faint and strange, that beneath his royal gloves, the skin had turned pale and waxy. Yet every morning Baldwin rose with the same precision and dignity as if nothing was wrong, walking down the marble corridors that overlooked the desert, listening to the bells call his subjects to prayer. He had begun to understand the art of concealment. For the first duty of a king, he believed, was to protect his people, even from the truth of his own suffering. At 13, Baldwin learned what it meant to command men older, harder, and far more cynical than himself. The barons who had sworn loyalty to his father now circled him like wolves, testing whether the young king had any real power behind the crown. He saw their glances, their smirks, the way they whispered to each other in the corners of the throne room. Speaking of alliances, regencies, and succession, he heard the word leper more than once, though never in his presence. Yet Baldwin, even in that fragile age, possessed a mind sharper than the blades that glittered at his belt. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did, his words fell with a weight that made older men uneasy. He would rather sit silently for an hour than speak a careless sentence. He had learned early that kingship was not a performance of strength, but the endurance of solitude. By the time the boy turned 14, the disease had made itself known in ways no robe could hide. The first dark patches appeared on his arms, the skin numb, but slowly turning rough like parchment. He hid it beneath long sleeves, even in the heat, and the courtiers pretended not to notice. But the rumors spread through Jerusalem like wildfire that their young king was cursed, that he would not live to manhood, that God himself had turned his face away. Still, Baldwin did not retreat. He began riding out to inspect his fortresses, visiting the walls of Ascalon, Acre, and Tyre, where the scent of salt mixed with stone and seaweed. The people came to see him, a thin youth on a white horse, his face wrapped against the sun, his voice quiet yet commanding. They said that when he spoke, soldiers stood straighter, as if something invisible passed from him to them, a belief that if their king, with all his pain, could still lead them, then surely they could fight a little longer for the city of God. In those years, Saladin was gathering his armies in the south, his banners of green and gold rising like a storm across the sand. Baldwin studied him not as a monster, but as a mirror, another man chosen by fate to carry the burden of faith and empire. Saladin's spies brought word that the Christian king was ill, perhaps already dying, and that the kingdom of Jerusalem would soon collapse under its own weight. But Baldwin, even as his hands blackened and the first smell of rot reached him, understood that the appearance of weakness could be a weapon. If they thought him dying, they would underestimate him, and that, he believed, was when he could strike hardest. When he was 15, Baldwin rode into battle for the first time. The sun was merciless that day, turning the helmets of his knights into mirrors that reflected fire across the dunes. He wore a red cloak to hide the stains from his wounds, and beneath his gloves his fingers were already losing shape, curling inward as if clinging to life. Yet when he lifted his sword, the army roared, not out of duty, but out of something deeper, a kind of grief mixed with devotion. That was the strange magic of Baldwin's reign. He ruled not through fear or wealth, but through pity, transformed into awe. His people could not stop watching him decay, and in that decay they saw their own mortality, their own faith tested and sharpened. When the Battle of Montgisard came 2 years later, Baldwin's courage reached the edge of legend. He had only a handful of knights against Saladin's legions, yet he ordered an attack so sudden, so reckless, that even his generals thought he had gone mad, wrapped in linen and chainmail to hold his body together. The Leper King rode ahead of them all, his blue eyes burning through the slit of his helmet. They said the sand around him turned red as the swords clashed, that his voice carried over the battlefield like a prayer. When the fighting ended, Saladin's army lay shattered, and Baldwin, barely conscious, had to be lifted from his saddle. But he smiled as the trumpets sounded the victory. It would be the last time he ever felt the heat of a battlefield on his skin. After Montgisard, Baldwin's decline was swift and pitiless. His fingers turned black, and his feet lost all feeling. His eyelids stiffened so that he could no longer close them. The light hurt, yet he could not escape it. Servants began to carry him on a litter, their faces pale as they inhaled the faint sweet stench of death that followed him everywhere. The throne was padded with silk to keep the bones of his back from bruising. Still, he ruled. He dictated laws and signed decrees with the remains of his hand. His voice growing thinner, his passions deeper. He became a ghost seated on gold, a man both living and dead. The court began to whisper again about regents, about heirs, about who would rule when the Leper King's heart finally stopped. His sister Sibylla's husband, Guy of Lusignan, hovered like a vulture, his ambition greater than his courage. Baldwin saw through him immediately. He trusted no one except his few remaining friends and the priests who prayed over his wounds at night. Yet he clung to power with the calm of someone who had already accepted death. To him, life was no longer something to lose. It was something to use. Every hour alive was another chance to delay Jerusalem's fall. Another act of defiance against both his enemies and his disease. At times, he would ask to be carried to the roof of the palace, where he could feel the desert wind on what was left of his face. There, beneath the evening sky, he would listen to the distant chant of monks and the faint cries of merchants closing their stalls in the city below. Those moments, brief and wordless, were his prayers. He no longer begged for healing. He only asked for time. And somehow, time obeyed him. He lived longer than anyone had predicted. Long enough to outlast his doubters. Long enough to see his enemies falter. Long enough to carve his name into the silence of history. His kingdom did not love him because he was powerful, but because he refused to die. That refusal became a kind of miracle. And so, as night descended over the holy city, the people of Jerusalem began to tell stories of their king, not as a man of flesh, but as a relic already half in heaven. Mothers whispered his name to their children before sleep. Knights prayed for courage in his image. And even those who had once doubted him found themselves kneeling in awe before the boy who rotted alive and still ruled with grace. The Leper King had become more than mortal. He was the living embodiment of endurance, the proof that faith could outlast flesh. And though his skin had begun to fall away, piece by piece, his spirit only grew stronger, glowing faintly beneath the ruin like a candle that burns brightest just before the wind snuffs it out. There were nights when Baldwin could no longer sleep, when the fever that crawled beneath his skin turned his body into a cage of heat and trembling. He would lie awake, listening to the soft shuffle of servants beyond his door, the low hum of prayers murmured by monks who kept vigil in the corridor, and the faint song of the wind moving through the cracks of the palace walls. In those hours, he thought not of pain but of purpose, of how strange it was that a man already half in the grave could still hold the fate of thousands in his hands. His disease had stripped him of everything youth, beauty, strength, but not the one thing that no affliction could touch his will. It was that will alone that kept Jerusalem alive. Each morning, attendants would lift him gently from his bed, careful not to tear the skin that had become as fragile as parchment. His robes had to be lined with silk to prevent chafing. The crown that once symbolized glory now had to be supported by cushions, for the weight of gold could bruise his scalp. He could no longer stand unaided, but he refused to remain confined to his chamber. They carried him to the throne room, his body swathed in linen, and the faint scent of rosemary meant to mask the odor that clung to him. The courtiers bowed deeply, keeping their eyes lowered. He could feel their pity, their horror, their helplessness, but he would not let them see him as a victim. He forced his trembling voice to command, his fading sight to observe, and his crumbling flesh to remind them that duty did not die with beauty. The council meetings became battles of their own. Around the polished stone table, the barons of Jerusalem argued like vultures over a dying carcass. They debated alliances, quarreled over taxes, and whispered about the succession. Baldwin listened quietly, his expression unreadable behind the mask of disease that had swallowed his once fine features. Only when their noise became unbearable would he lift his hand, little more than a bundle of bones wrapped in gauze, and the room would fall silent. His words came slowly, the syllables drawn out by the effort of breathing. But his judgment was sharp as ever. Even his enemies admitted it. The Leper King's mind remained untouched, clearer than any of theirs. He spoke of patience, of holding the borders, of not letting pride drag the kingdom into ruin. Some nights, when the meeting ended, he would cough until blood filled his throat, and they would carry him away, still dictating orders between gasps of air. It was during one of these years of slow decline that he summoned his sister, Sibylla, to his side. She entered the dim chamber with her husband, Guy of Lusignan, trailing behind her like a shadow he could not shake. Baldwin looked at them both for a long time, seeing not siblings or kin, but the ghosts of future disaster. He had seen enough of Guy's ambition to know it was hollow, like a sword made of tin, yet Sibylla loved him, and love, in Baldwin's eyes, was as dangerous as war. The Leper King's voice trembled when he spoke, yet there was no weakness in it. He told them that if he died, Jerusalem must not fall into hands unworthy of its burden. He would crown his nephew, the child Baldwin the Fourth, as co-king, to secure the line of succession. The words fell like stones into a still pond. Guy clenched his jaw but said nothing. The queen bowed, tears catching in her lashes. The dying king had made his decision, and no one dared challenge him. Outside the palace walls, the city of Jerusalem pulsed with both devotion and decay. Pilgrims arrived daily, kneeling on the same stones that had once been wet with Christ's blood. Merchants shouted from their stalls. Spices burned in the markets. The bells called the faithful to prayer. And above it all, the citadel glimmered beneath the desert sun. Yet beneath that beauty, there was fear. The people knew their king was rotting alive. And though they loved him for his courage, they dreaded what his death would bring. Baldwin had become both a talisman and a warning, a living reminder that holiness could not protect them from the mortality of men. The disease, relentless as time, began to consume his face. His nose collapsed, the cartilage eaten away. His lips cracked and bled until he could no longer eat solid food. His eyes, unable to close, had to be bathed in oil each night, so that the corneas would not dry and blind him completely. The pain was constant now, a slow, steady fire that never left his bones. Yet he endured it in silence, refusing the opium tinctures his physicians offered. "I must think," he told them once, "and the pain helps me remember that I'm still alive." His attendants wept at those words, though he could no longer see their tears. By the time he turned 20, Baldwin was more rumor than ruler. He had become a figure of myth, a king who ruled from his litter, his flesh falling away, his voice echoing through incense and shadow. The people said he no longer needed eyes to see or hands to command, that angels whispered his decrees and demons fled from his presence. In truth, he was only a man, exhausted and afraid, but too proud to let anyone know. He began to write letters to foreign rulers, begging for aid that never came. Europe was busy with its own wars, its kings too distant to care about the dying boy who still guarded Christ's tomb. And so Baldwin learned another kind of solitude, the solitude of being forgotten by the very world he had sacrificed his body to protect. Then came the year when Saladin returned. His armies marched north again, banners snapping like fire in the desert wind. Cities fell, one by one, and the fear that Baldwin had held at bay for so long returned to his people's eyes. But even now, blind and carried by servants. He refused to hide. When his generals hesitated to march, the king ordered himself brought to the front. They tried to stop him. His physicians pleaded. His priests begged. But Baldwin simply said, "If I am still king, then I will go." And so they carried him out, wrapped in linen, his armor strapped over bones that could barely bear its weight. When the soldiers saw their sovereign borne aloft like a corpse already prepared for burial, something fierce awoke in them. They cheered until their throats were raw. Even Saladin's scouts, seeing the litter gleaming among the crusader ranks, wrote that the sight chilled their hearts. In the end, Saladin withdrew rather than face the Leper King in open battle. Whether it was strategy or superstition, no one knew. But Baldwin returned to Jerusalem triumphant once more. His victory won, not with strength, but with the terror of his endurance. They said that even the Sultan himself had admitted admiration for the dying monarch, saying, "That man is truly a king." When Baldwin was brought back to his chamber, his body nearly broken from the journey, the priests gathered to give him last rites. He refused them gently. "Not yet," he whispered. "The city still stands." He lay there for days, neither awake nor asleep, his breath shallow, his heart stubborn. The candles burned down one by one, and outside, the bells of Jerusalem rang for evening prayers. The sound seemed to calm him, as if each toll carried him a little closer to peace. But even as death circled closer, Baldwin still thought of his people. He called his nephew once more to his side, placed his withered hand upon the boy's head, and told him to remember that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The boy nodded, though he was too young to understand. The Leper King smiled faintly. "Then perhaps," he said, "my kingdom will live a little longer." And as the night settled over the holy city, Baldwin closed what was left of his eyes, listening to the whisper of wind through the narrow streets, knowing that even if the world forgot him, Jerusalem would remember the king who ruled while decomposing before God. The winter that followed his return from the battlefield was unlike any Jerusalem had known. The air hung thick with dust and the scent of old incense, and though the sun still burned above the city's domes, the palace grew colder with each passing night. Inside those walls, the Leper King lay between worlds, half sovereign, half relic, a living man whose body had long ceased to obey him. The courtiers no longer came to his chambers except when summoned. The physicians came and went like ghosts, leaving behind bowls of ointment and whispered prayers. And in that lonely quiet, Baldwin's thoughts began to wander through the corridors of memory, revisiting the faces of those who had once laughed beside him, the sound of his horse's hooves striking stone, the heat of battle when he had felt truly alive. Those moments were fragments now, flickering through the haze of fever, but they reminded him that once he had been more than this broken shell of bone and silence. He had always known the disease would take him piece by piece, but he had not imagined how slow it would be, how intimate the process of decay would become. Each morning, the servants peeled away the bandages that clung to his skin, and with them came small flecks of himself, flesh that no longer lived, strips of muscle that had dried to the texture of paper. The smell filled the chamber, sweet and sickly, and though they tried to mask it with oils of myrrh and cedar, the air itself seemed steeped in rot. Yet Baldwin never turned away. "Let it be," he would whisper. "It is the scent of truth." To him, this decay was not punishment, but revelation. He was learning, in the most brutal way possible, how little the body mattered when the will refused to die. Outside his doors, the kingdom that bore his name was beginning to crack. The nobles grew restless, their loyalties shifting like sand in the desert wind. Some pledged their allegiance to his sister Sibylla, others to her husband Guy, and still others to the child king Baldwin the Fifth. In the markets, whispers spread that the king was already dead, and that his servants merely moved his corpse to maintain the illusion of order. But those who served him knew better. They had seen the light in his eyes, the mind that refused to dim. Even when he could no longer stand, Baldwin's presence commanded obedience. He listened to reports of raids along the borders, of broken treaties and vanishing supplies, and each time his voice weak, rasping, yet resolute, cut through the fear. "Hold the line," he would say. "Jerusalem has survived worse than death." In those days, he asked often for William of Tyre, the old tutor who had once discovered the first numbness in his hand so many years before. William came to him quietly, bringing news of the world beyond the palace. He read aloud from chronicles of the crusades, reminding the king of the legacy he had inherited and the burden he would pass on. Sometimes Baldwin would interrupt, asking him to describe the gardens of Tyre or the sea near Acre, places he would never see again. William spoke gently, describing the silver light on the waves, the fishermen calling to one another across the water. The king listened with a faint smile, as though the words themselves could carry him beyond the pain, beyond the confines of his room. When the reading ended, he would murmur, "It is enough. The sea remembers even those who cannot touch it." But no peace lasted long. The world beyond Jerusalem was changing swiftly. Saladin's power grew with every moon, and his armies began to surround the kingdom like a tightening fist. Baldwin knew the city could not survive another great siege. He could no longer lead his men into battle, no longer lift a sword, but he could still command with words, and words, he knew, were sometimes sharper than steel. When he learned that Guy of Lusignan had once again failed to confront the enemy, hesitating at the fortress of Kerek while Saladin's banners closed in, Baldwin's fury burned brighter than any fever. Against every plea from his court, he ordered himself carried to the front lines. His attendants tried to protest, but he silenced them with a look. "If I am to die," he said, "let it be where courage still matters." The journey was agony. The litter rocked across the rough roads, jarring his fragile bones, reopening wounds that had barely healed. The air outside was sharp with sand and smoke, and every breath scraped his throat like glass. Yet when the army saw him arrive, the sight of their rotting king being borne toward battle filled them with a kind of holy shame. Here was a man who could barely breathe, yet had come to lead them once more. He dismissed Guy in front of the assembled knights, his voice trembling but unmistakable. "You will no longer speak in my name," he declared. "I command this host myself." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The chroniclers would later say that when Baldwin's litter appeared on the ridge, overlooking the fortress, even the enemy camp fell still. From afar, he looked less like a king than a corpse wrapped in cloth of gold. But to his soldiers, he was something greater, a reminder of what devotion could look like when stripped of all earthly strength. Under his command, the Crusader banners advanced, their movements slow but steady, like the tide creeping toward the shore. When news reached Saladin that the Leper King himself had come to Kerek, the Sultan is said to have withdrawn, unwilling to defile the honor of battle with what he called a miracle of endurance. The victory, though bloodless, came at a terrible cost. Baldwin's condition worsened beyond repair. His attendants carried him back to Jerusalem in silence, the litter surrounded by soldiers who wept openly for the man they called the living saint. He could no longer see, for the disease had claimed his eyes completely. But he still knew when the city walls rose before him. He could smell the stone dust, the faint sweetness of the olive trees beyond the gates, and the incense drifting from the churches. "Home," he whispered, and the word lingered in the air like a prayer. Back in the palace, his chambers had been prepared for what everyone knew would be his last winter. The priests kept vigil by candlelight, reading psalms that melted into the hum of wind against the windows. Baldwin asked that his nephew, the boy king, be brought to him. When the child knelt beside the bed, Baldwin placed his withered hand upon the boy's shoulder, feeling the pulse of youth beneath his fingertips, a pulse he no longer possessed. "Rule with mercy," he said softly, "for strength fades, but mercy endures." The boy nodded, frightened and solemn, and Baldwin smiled, though his lips barely moved. "Then Jerusalem will not die with me." The nights grew longer after that. Sometimes, the attendants found him murmuring prayers to himself, sometimes staring blindly toward the faint sound of bells from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. On one such night, when even the candles seemed too weary to burn, Baldwin whispered to his confessor that he no longer feared death. "It has been my companion for so long," he said, "that I would not know how to live without it." The priest, overcome, could not answer, and so, as spring approached, the Leper King lay still beneath the heavy curtains of his chamber, surrounded by silence and the faint perfume of flowers brought by the faithful. His breath came shallow and uneven, his heart stuttering like a fading drum. But to the end, he listened for the sounds beyond his room, the footsteps of guards, the rustle of the city that still lived because he had refused to die. And when at last he could hear them no more, when even the whisper of Jerusalem faded from his mind, Baldwin the Fourth, king of the holy city and prisoner of his own body, exhaled one final time and fell into the peace he had earned. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the rooftops, and the bells began to ring for morning prayers. The kingdom did not yet know that its king had left it, but in that golden hour, the air over Jerusalem felt strangely still, as if the city itself were pausing to remember the man who had ruled it from the edge of death and never looked away. When dawn finally broke over Jerusalem, the city did not yet know that its king was gone. The bells that rang across the rooftops were meant to summon the faithful to prayer, but their sound carried something softer that morning, something like grief disguised as habit. Inside the palace, the chamber was still dim, lit only by the thin flame of candles that trembled each time a servant moved. Baldwin's body lay beneath a sheet of white linen, his face hidden, his crown resting on a small altar beside him. Those who entered did so quietly, their steps echoing in the silence that always follows a long struggle, finally ended. He had not cried out at the end. There had been no last gasp. Noplea. It was as if death had simply found him asleep and decided not to wake him. The priests came first, their robes brushing against the cold stone floor as they prepared his body according to the rites of the kingdom. But nothing could prepare them for what they saw. Beneath the linen, the Leper King had been reduced to something hardly human skin clinging to bone, fingers twisted into blackened claws, the nose and cheeks eroded until the face was more skull than flesh. Yet even in that ruin, there was a strange serenity. His eyes, though blind, had remained open at the moment of death, and the attendants whispered that they seemed to gaze not upward or inward, but outward, toward the city he had given his life to protect. They bathed him in oils of myrrh and spikenard, though the stench of decay could not be hidden, and when they lifted his body, the sheet beneath was stained with the last traces of the disease that had devoured him from within. Word spread slowly through Jerusalem. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the people began to gather outside the palace gates. No proclamation had yet been made, but somehow they already knew. There was a heaviness in the air, a silence that settled even over the markets. Merchants stopped shouting. Beggars stopped pleading, and the sound of hooves on the cobblestones echoed without answer. The city that had seen centuries of blood and miracles now stood still for a king who had done neither in life nor in death, but who had simply endured. When the news was finally spoken aloud, a sound rose through the streets, not the wail of mourning, but the deep, broken murmur of prayers whispered by thousands of voices. The people did not grieve him as they would a conqueror. They grieved him as one of their own. Mothers lifted their children to see the palace balcony, where a single black banner had been hung. The banner did not bear a cross or a crown, only a strip of linen, the same cloth once used to bind the wounds of lepers. It was a symbol of suffering, yes, but also of grace. For the first time in living memory, the people of Jerusalem saw holiness not in victory or splendor, but in decay born with courage. The funeral procession began at dusk. They carried his body through the narrow streets, the bier draped in gold and white, guarded by knights who had once followed him into battle. The scent of incense followed them, thick and heavy, blending with the air's faint bitterness of dust and rosewater. Along the way, men and women knelt as the litter passed, not out of fear, but reverence. Some wept. Others reached out to touch the edge of his shroud, believing it might bring them healing. Even those who had once doubted him bowed their heads. They could not look upon the boy who had ruled them through rot and pain without feeling that they had witnessed something divine in human form. When the procession reached the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the doors were thrown open, and the light of hundreds of candles poured out into the night. The air inside was warm and thick with smoke, and the hymns of the priests rolled through the arches like waves on a distant sea. They laid him before the altar, and for the first time in centuries, a leper was granted burial in the holiest place on earth. The law forbade it. Tradition rejected it, but love had overturned both. For this one man, the boundary between cursed and blessed had dissolved. The clergy who once would have shunned his touch now bent to kiss his ruined hands. As the service began, the great bells of the church rang, their tones deep and sorrowful. Each toll was like a heartbeat fading into the silence between worlds. Nobles stood beside beggars, knights beside pilgrims, and even foreign merchants who had once scorned the crippled king found themselves whispering prayers. There was no speech of triumph, no promise of glory, only a shared understanding that they had lost the one man who had carried their city on his shoulders long after his body could no longer bear its weight. When the final chant faded, the priests lowered his coffin into the stone floor, sealing it beneath the earth that covered so many martyrs and saints. The sound of the lid closing was soft, yet final, a single note marking the end of a reign that had defied both nature and time. The candles flickered, and for a moment, the air grew utterly still. Then a draught swept through the church, and those closest to the tomb swore they smelled not decay, but something faintly sweet, like the scent of rain on dry stone. Outside, night had fallen, and Jerusalem's streets glowed with lantern light. Yet, for all its beauty, the city felt hollow. Without Baldwin's will to hold it together, the fragile order he had built began to crumble. Factions rose almost immediately, supporters of Sibylla and Guy on one side, those loyal to the child king Baldwin the Fourth on the other. The Leper King had tried to bind them with his dying breath, but his death only deepened their divisions. Within a year, his nephew too would be gone, and the struggle for the crown would tear the kingdom apart. The very thing Baldwin had fought to prevent the chaos of ambition unleashed was now inevitable. In the months that followed, rumors began to spread through the city, strange and unsettling. Some said that at night, when the wind howled through the corridors of the palace, The scent of rot returned, faint but unmistakable. Seeping from the empty throne room, others swore they saw a shadow sitting upon the throne, motionless, crowned in moonlight. The priests dismissed it as superstition, yet even they avoided the hall after dark. The golden seat, they said, had absorbed too much suffering to ever be clean again. The throne had become his tomb, as much as the stone that covered his body, a reminder that some burdens leave traces that never fade. As for the people, they carried his memory in quieter ways. In the markets, mothers told their children that courage was not the absence of fear, but the strength to rise even when flesh fails. In the monasteries, monks copied his story into illuminated manuscripts, painting his figure not as diseased, but radiant, a halo of gold surrounding the twisted hands that had once ruled a kingdom. And in the years to come, when invaders once more breached Jerusalem's walls and the cross was torn down from its towers, those few who escaped would say that, as the city burned, they smelled a faint sweetness in the smoke, a scent like myrrh and death, mingled together, as if the Leper King himself had risen once more to watch over the ruins he had loved. So history closed its chapter on Baldwin the Fourth, but the echo of his reign lingered in every prayer, every tear, every stone of that sacred city. He had ruled while rotting, he had led while blind, and he had loved his people even when they pitied him. And though time would erase kingdoms and kings alike, there would always remain the legend of the boy who refused to surrender, whose flesh failed, but whose spirit endured like light, trapped within the cracks of a dying flame. And in the quiet after his passing, Jerusalem herself seemed to breathe, whispering to the wind a single name, as if the city knew that even in death, her king had never truly left her. In the weeks that followed the funeral, Jerusalem existed in a strange twilight between reverence and fear, as though the city itself did not know whether to mourn or to breathe again. The markets reopened, the bells continued to ring, and pilgrims still came to pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But beneath the surface there was a quiet trembling that could not be silenced. The throne stood empty in the great hall of the palace, draped in black and gold, and even the guards who walked past it lowered their eyes, unable to look upon the seat that had once held a man who had ruled from the edge of death. No one could sit there without feeling the weight of his presence. The air still carried the faint scent of incense mixed with something metallic and unnameable, as if the stones themselves remembered the odor of a king's slow decay. The council met often now, but their meetings were hollow, without the voice that had once bound them together. Raymond of Tripoli, wise but weary, argued for caution. Guy of Lusignan, impatient and vain, argued for power. Sibylla, the late king's sister, wept in public and plotted in private, torn between her loyalty to her brother's memory and the ambition of her husband. Every corner of the kingdom seemed to hold its own rumour, its own truth, and its own plan for survival. Some said Baldwin's death had cursed them, that the disease which had consumed his body had somehow infected the kingdom itself. Others believed his spirit still guarded Jerusalem, unseen but ever watchful, warning them to tread carefully or lose everything. For a while, the boy king Baldwin the Fifth offered a fragile hope. He was gentle, bright-eyed, and kind, too young to understand the treachery that surrounded him. The people cheered him in the streets, calling him the Leper King's miracle, the last gift of a ruler who had refused to surrender. But the court, restless and divided, whispered of the boy's weakness. He coughed often, and the physicians exchanged nervous glances when his fever rose. When he died less than a year later, before his 9th birthday, the city fell into chaos. The bells rang again, this time without faith. It was as though Jerusalem herself had exhaled for the last time. After the boy's death, Sibylla crowned herself queen and placed the crown upon her husband's head, declaring Guy of Lusignan king. The nobles watched in silence, their hearts heavy with the memory of the man who had fought to prevent this moment. Baldwin the Fourth had seen through Guy's smile, had known that ambition without wisdom was poison, and now that poison began to spread through every hall of power. Guy was not cruel, but he was foolish, and worse, he believed himself chosen. He ordered feasts when he should have fortified walls, promised glory when he should have prayed for mercy, and spoke of destiny while the world around him began to crumble. Beyond the desert, Saladin waited. He had not forgotten the Leper King who had once defied him, who had faced him with a body already half dead and still refused to yield. In Baldwin's time, Saladin had withdrawn from battle, perhaps out of respect, perhaps because he sensed that the young monarch's courage had drawn divine favor. But with the Leper King gone, the spell was broken. The Sultan gathered his armies once more, an ocean of men and banners stretching from Damascus to Cairo, and when they marched, the earth itself seemed to tremble. They crossed the sands like a tide of green and gold, moving toward Jerusalem with the patience of fate. In the summer of the year 1187, the two armies met near a place called Hattin. The Crusader host was vast, to boot disorganized, weakened by arrogance and thirst. Guy led them into the desert without water, chasing shadows of an enemy that did not intend to be caught. When the Muslims finally surrounded them, the sun turned merciless. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and the wind carried the scent of fire and dust. The true cross, that sacred relic once carried into victory by Baldwin himself, was raised high among the Crusaders, glinting in the blinding light. But there would be no miracle that day. By sunset, the relic was taken, the army broken, and the desert littered with the bodies of men who had once believed themselves invincible. Guy was captured, and Jerusalem, left defenseless, fell soon after. When the news reached Europe, it spread like wildfire, igniting a new crusade that would bring kings and emperors to the Holy Land. But it was already too late. The dream that Baldwin had preserved with his suffering had turned to dust within 2 years of his death. Some said the kingdom fell because its new rulers lacked his faith. Others whispered that it was because God had granted him the strength to hold it together only for as long as his heart continued to beat. When Saladin entered Jerusalem, he did not burn the city, as many had feared. Instead, he walked through the gates quietly, his soldiers in solemn formation, and ordered that the Christians be spared. The chroniclers wrote that when he passed the church of the Holy Sepulchre, he removed his sandals and bowed his head. No one knows if he remembered the Leper King in that moment, but many believed he did, for even enemies had spoken of Baldwin with respect. He had been both a rival and a mirror, a man whose suffering reflected the strength of his soul. Saladin ordered that the churches remain intact and allowed the Christians who could pay ransom to leave unharmed. In that act of mercy, some said, there lingered the faint echo of the man who had once ruled the city with dying hands. Years passed, and Jerusalem changed hands again and again. The great walls Baldwin had strengthened were rebuilt, torn down, rebuilt again. His throne, once gleaming with gold, vanished. Some said it was melted for coin, others that it was taken by crusaders fleeing the city. Yet the stories persisted. Pilgrims who visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre swore that they felt a chill when they stood near the corner where the Leper King was said to rest. At night, the monks claimed to hear faint whispers rising from the floor, as if a voice still prayed for the city's soul. And though time dimmed his name, There were always those who remembered him not as a conqueror, but as something rarer, a ruler who had made holiness out of suffering. In the centuries that followed, poets wrote of Baldwin's courage, painting him as both saint and shadow. They told of the golden throne that retained the smell of his body, a scent that no fire or perfume could erase. And they called it the scent of kingship. They said it was not the smell of death, but of sacrifice, a reminder that power was never meant to be clean. Historians in distant lands debated whether such a man could have truly existed, for the story seemed too tragic, too impossible to belong to any single lifetime. Yet the chroniclers who had stood in his court had written it all down with trembling hands, and the records still sleep in dusty libraries. The boy with the pale hands, the king who ruled while dying, the body that rotted but refused to fall. And so, long after the Crusader kingdom had vanished, long after the banners of Islam and Christendom had traded places again and again, the legend of the Leper King endured. He became a symbol whispered in the halls of power, a warning to those who believed that kingship meant glory and not burden. For Baldwin's throne, they said, was not made of gold alone but of pain, and whoever sat upon it would inherit not his crown, but his curse. Yet even within that curse, there was grace. For the story of Baldwin the Fourth, told and retold across generations, became more than a tale of disease and death. It became a parable of endurance. In him, people found proof that the human spirit could outshine the frailty of the flesh. They remembered the young boy who could not feel pain, the soldier who led men to victory while his body crumbled, the king who faced death without flinching. And somewhere in the quiet heart of Jerusalem, where candles still burn and pilgrims still weep, it is said that the spirit of the Leper King lingers not as a ghost, but as a guardian, keeping watch over the city he could not save, but never truly lost. Centuries passed, and yet the memory of the Leper King did not fade with the shifting sands or the fall of empires. The years that followed his death carried the rise and ruin of countless rulers, each promising to reclaim or protect Jerusalem, each believing their glory would outlast time, and yet none of their names clung to the stones the way Baldwin's did. The people who came after him, pilgrims, conquerors, merchants, and monks, spoke of him in hushed tones, as though he were not merely a man who had lived, but a secret that Jerusalem itself refused to let die. Even when his tomb was lost beneath layers of reconstruction within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, when no inscription marked his resting place, the story of the boy who had ruled while his body decayed still haunted the faithful who knelt above him. By the 13th century, when new crusaders arrived from Europe, they found an old city wrapped in superstition and sorrow. The holy walls bore scars of countless sieges, and the air itself seemed older, heavier, as though it carried the weight of too many prayers unanswered. The priests of the Latin Church still whispered the tale of Baldwin's courage to the weary and the sick, telling them that holiness could be found even in suffering. For them, the Leper King had become more than a symbol of a lost kingdom. He was a saint of endurance, a reminder that faith was not tested in victory, but in the slow agony of decay, endured with grace. Many believed that his spirit lingered inside the church where he was buried, watching over the pilgrims who came to weep for their own lost hopes. Some swore that they had seen a faint glimmer in the candlelight near the altar, a reflection that did not move when the flames flickered, as if some unseen presence kept vigil there. Others said that when storms raged outside and thunder rolled over the Mount of Olives, the scent of myrrh and old blood filled the church, mingling with the incense. To them, that smell was not of death, but of protection. Even Muslim chroniclers, who had written of Saladin's triumph, remembered Baldwin with a curious reverence. They called him the king who feared no disease, and spoke of his patience as a gift from God. In their telling, he was not an enemy but a man chosen by fate to carry a burden that would have broken any other. They admired his courage because it mirrored something they understood, a belief that suffering could be a form of prayer, that honor could outlast defeat. Across faiths and centuries, Baldwin's legend belonged to no single people. He had become part of Jerusalem itself, woven into the silence between its stones. But even legends are shaped by those who tell them. In Europe, chroniclers softened his image, painting him as a golden youth whose illness only deepened his purity, as though he had been chosen to bear his kingdom's sins upon his withering flesh. They wrote of him as a martyr king, pure of heart and touched by divine sorrow, whose life had been a sermon written in blood. Artists later followed, depicting him seated upon his throne, wrapped in silver robes, his face hidden behind a mask, the light of sanctity glowing around him. In these paintings, he was both ghost and monarch, a figure suspended between heaven and earth. The reality, the horror of rotting flesh, the smell of necrosis, the agony of blindness was left out, replaced by holiness more palatable to those who had never known pain. Yet even through the softened brush of legend, something of the truth remained, for no artist could entirely erase the sadness from his eyes. Over time, his story crossed borders and tongues. In the monasteries of France, monks told it to novices as a lesson in humility. In the courts of England, troubadours sang of the young king whose courage outshone his body's ruin. Even in distant Italy, sculptors carved his likeness upon cathedral doors, portraying him as a reminder that beauty and decay are never far apart. Every age remade him in its image, some as a saint, some as a symbol of divine punishment, and others as a tragic hero standing alone against the inevitability of time. And yet, no matter how many centuries passed, the city that had birthed his legend remained restless. Jerusalem was taken, lost, and taken again. Empires came and went like tides, leaving their languages, their prayers, and their bones in the dust. Through it all, Baldwin's name endured. Pilgrims walking the Via Dolorosa would sometimes stop and whisper a prayer not only to Christ, but to the Leper King who had ruled that same sacred ground. For them, Baldwin was proof that even in ruin, there could be majesty. That even in death, there could be devotion. As centuries deepened into silence, scholars rediscovered the chronicles written by William of Tyre, his old tutor and historian. In those fragile pages, browned by age, they read the words of a man who had loved his student and mourned him as both king and child. William's writing was neither myth nor flattery. It was sorrow written in ink. He described the first time he saw the boy who felt no pain, the trembling realization that this bright child carried a curse, and the years that followed when disease took everything except the boy's spirit. Those words became the foundation of every tale that came after. And even now, historians can still trace the faint shape of Baldwin's humanity through William's grief. Modern eyes, centuries later, would read those accounts and try to translate them into medicine, science, and logic. They would name his illness Hansen's disease, classify its stages, and map its slow invasion of the body. They would call him a case study of history, an early example of the power of the will to overcome the limits of flesh. But none of that would capture the soul of his story. For Baldwin was not simply a patient, nor merely a king. He was a paradox, made flesh weakness transformed into strength, decay turned into devotion. He did not inspire armies through fear, nor govern through cruelty, but through something older and deeper, the faith that courage itself was sacred. It is said that on quiet nights, when the city lies still and the moonlight spills over the domes and rooftops, the shadow of a man can sometimes be seen moving along the walls of the old palace that no longer stands. Some claim it is the ghost of Baldwin, still walking the ramparts he once defended, still watching over the streets where pilgrims kneel and prayers rise like smoke. Others say it is not a ghost at all, but the memory of devotion itself, given form by the faith of those who refuse to forget him. And perhaps that is what he became in the end. Not a relic of kingship, not a saint or a spectre, but a quiet guardian of a city that has always belonged to both the living and the dead. His throne is gone, his tomb unmarked, his kingdom dust. Yet his endurance lingers like a heartbeat beneath the centuries. For even time, that great conqueror, could not erase the echo of the Leper King, whose rotting flesh once ruled a holy city and whose soul, undiminished, still whispers through the silence that courage need not be beautiful, only unwavering. There are cities that sleep beneath the weight of history, and there are cities that never truly rest. Jerusalem was the latter, a place where the past pressed so close to the present that one could feel it in the air, like a pulse beneath the stone. Centuries after Baldwin's death, the city had changed hands more times than any scribe could count. Yet something of his reign still haunted its quiet corners. The priests still lit candles where he was said to have prayed, and in the nights when wind moaned through the cloisters, they sometimes thought they heard the faint rustle of cloth, the whisper of a voice reciting the same prayers he had murmured while his flesh fell away. Even those who no longer believed in saints could not deny the strange power that lingered there. That sense of presence born not of superstition but of remembrance. By the time the age of crusades faded into myth, Baldwin had become more than a name from a lost kingdom. He was a lesson, a warning, and a comfort, depending on who spoke his story. For the faithful, he was proof that suffering could be divine, that endurance could cleanse sin. For the rulers who followed, he was a mirror of what power truly cost. And for the dying in monasteries, in battlefields, in quiet rooms where candles burned low, he was the patron of those who faced their end with dignity. Monks in distant lands carved his likeness into wood and stone, not crowned in gold, but wrapped in bandages. His eyes turned heavenward, his face neither whole nor broken, but peaceful. His legend crossed oceans, carried by word of mouth and manuscript alike, until even those who did not remember the details of his reign could still whisper his epithet, the king who rotted alive but ruled unbowed. In one old chronicle written centuries after his passing, a pilgrim from France described standing inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at midnight, the air thick with incense and candle smoke. He wrote of how the ground seemed to hum faintly beneath his feet, as though the stones themselves remembered the footsteps of those who had walked before. And there, near the edge of the altar, he claimed to feel a sudden warmth, a small pulse, like a heartbeat buried deep in the earth. He fell to his knees and wept, not out of fear, but recognition. It was him. He wrote, "The king still keeps watch." Scholars dismissed the account as the fancy of a weary traveller. Yet the tale spread, as such things always do. People began to leave small tokens near the supposed site of his tomb: a silver coin, a lock of hair, a ring engraved with prayers, until the floor beneath the altar glittered faintly with devotion. There is something in human hearts that clings to stories of endurance, especially when the world itself seems to decay. In times of plague and war, Baldwin's story was told again and again, a reminder that flesh might fail, but spirit endures. When leprosy swept through medieval Europe, some afflicted pilgrims made the long journey to Jerusalem to pray at his resting place, believing that the king who had shared their suffering might intercede for them. They came covered in rags, their faces hidden, their bodies trembling from disease and exhaustion. Yet when they reached the church, the priests did not turn them away. Perhaps it was superstition, or perhaps it was mercy learned from Baldwin's example. But for those moments, the unclean were allowed to kneel beside the clean. They lit candles for a man who had been one of them, and they whispered his name as though it were a bridge between agony and grace. Over time, the legend changed shape once more. In one version, Baldwin was said to have appeared in a dream to a dying monk, his face luminous, his hands whole again. In another, he was said to have stood upon the walls of Jerusalem during one of the later sieges, his spectral figure guiding the defenders through the smoke of battle. The people did not care whether these stories were true. What mattered was that they felt true. For the city that had seen so much suffering, it was easier to believe that the Leper King had never left than to accept that even courage must fade. Centuries rolled into dust. The world moved on. The language of kings changed. And so did the prayers. Yet Baldwin's name survived in the strangest places. In the libraries of scholars who studied the forgotten Crusader states, in the writings of philosophers who pondered the relationship between pain and purpose, in the quiet reflections of soldiers who found themselves broken but not beaten, the world no longer believed in divine punishment or in leprosy as a curse. Yet it still believed in what Baldwin had embodied: the defiance of the human will against the betrayal of the body. When medicine finally conquered leprosy in the modern age, when antibiotics replaced exile and understanding replaced fear, there were doctors who looked back to Baldwin's story and saw in it something almost prophetic. A man who lived centuries before science could explain his illness had faced it with the serenity that even modern medicine could not teach. One physician visiting Jerusalem in the 20th century wrote in his journal, after standing inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, "It was not disease that destroyed his kingdom. It was the fear of it. And perhaps that has not changed." Those words carried the echo of the same truth that had always been at the heart of Baldwin's life: that fear, not death, was the real conqueror. In the years that followed, artists rediscovered him again. This time not as a saint, but as a symbol of resilience. A sculptor in Rome carved a statue of Baldwin seated upon a throne that seemed to melt beneath him, his hands skeletal, his gaze calm. A filmmaker once recreated his story, imagining him behind a silver mask, his voice low and distant, his pain hidden behind the dignity of rule. And though history itself often forgets the names of those who suffer quietly, audiences were moved, not by his victories but by his stillness. They saw in him a reflection of their own struggles, the invisible illnesses, the slow losses, the moments of strength found in silence. The Leper King had become timeless not because of war, but because of endurance, and somewhere deep within the walls of the church that had cradled his final breath, the air still holds the echo of that endurance. The monks who tend the candles say that on certain nights, when the last pilgrim has gone and the doors are closed, the flames flicker without reason. The shadows seem to bend toward the same spot, a patch of marble near the altar, where the light never fully fades. Some say it is a draught, others a trick of the eye, but those who have stood there in silence swear they can feel it a presence. Neither warm nor cold, but steady, watching, waiting. Perhaps that is all Baldwin ever wanted. Not glory, not sainthood, but remembrance. To be proof that a man could face decay without surrendering to it. To remind the living that courage does not roar. Sometimes it merely endures, quietly, through the long night. And as the centuries stretch onward, Jerusalem remains what it has always been, a city of wounds and miracles, of death and rebirth, and somewhere within its heart, the Leper King still endures, unseen but unforgotten, whispering to the restless world that the body is dust. But the will, once awakened, never truly dies. The centuries that followed turned Baldwin's story into something both sacred and fragile, passed down not through the sound of trumpets or the pomp of kings, but through whispers, through the soft rustle of parchment and the faint glow of candlelight in monasteries that still copied his name. His legend had outlived the politics that birthed it. Empires rose. Empires fell. Yet the story of the boy who ruled while dying endured as if protected by time itself. By the dawn of the modern world, when men began to measure the stars and dissect the mysteries of flesh, Baldwin was no longer remembered as a monarch or even as a Christian saint. He was remembered as a mirror, a reflection of what it meant to be human, to fight against decay while knowing that defeat was certain. In the age of science and skepticism, scholars revisited the chronicles of William of Tyre, seeking fact where once there had been reverence. They calculated the symptoms, the timeline, the slow ruin of nerves and tissue. They studied his reign not as a tragedy, but as a phenomenon, a case study in leadership under impossible conditions. Yet the deeper they analyzed him, the more they found that reason could not strip away the power of the myth. For no medical diagnosis could explain how a man with failing eyes, numb limbs, and blackened hands had held together a kingdom balanced between empires. Something beyond flesh had ruled Jerusalem in those years, something fierce, incorruptible, and invisible. Even the most pragmatic historians, as they read the final pages of his story, found themselves pausing before writing the words, "He died." Because in truth, Baldwin never really did. There are letters, old and half-faded, written by pilgrims who visited the Holy Land during the 18th century, describing strange encounters within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. One speaks of a man cloaked in silver grey who stood silently near the altar at dawn, his face hidden behind a veil. The pilgrim approached to ask if he was a priest, but the man turned, and where his eyes should have been, they were hollows filled with light. When the pilgrim fell to his knees, trembling, the figure said nothing, only raised a bandaged hand in blessing before fading into the incense smoke. The account was dismissed as imagination, but the story endured, carried home across the sea, and retold in fireside whispers as the vigil of the Leper King. Some century later, as Jerusalem fell under the rhythm of new rulers and new prayers, the tomb where Baldwin had been buried was renovated again, the layers of stone rebuilt to accommodate new altars. When the workers dug near the foundations, they found no intact coffin, only traces of silk and fragments of bone mixed with dust. Yet one of the masons swore he found a faint golden shimmer beneath the earth, like the gleam of candlelight trapped within the stone itself. When he brushed it with his hand, it vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of myrrh. He told the priests, who said nothing, but sealed the floor again in silence. For some things in Jerusalem are not meant to be disturbed. As the modern age grew noisier and brighter, Baldwin's name became quieter but not forgotten. His story survived in art, in cinema, in songs sung by choirs who perhaps never realized that the words they sang belonged to a dying king. His mask, imagined and reinvented, became a symbol in paintings and films, the shining barrier between duty and despair. When the world rediscovered his story through modern retelling, they were struck not by the cruelty of his disease, but by the stillness of his strength. He became an emblem of all who fought private battles in silence, those who carried pain the world could not see, yet kept their composure, their grace, their sense of purpose. In hospitals and recovery wards, some found his image, comforting the Leper King, who had continued to lead while disintegrating inside his armor. Nurses lit candles in his name, not out of religious tradition, but because they felt that he understood something about the human condition that medicine could not heal. His courage transcended creed. People of all faiths and none began to see in him a truth that belonged to everyone, that dignity could coexist with decay, and that even the dying could rule their own spirit. There is an account, written by a historian in the early 20th century, who visited Jerusalem and stood before the altar, said to be built over Baldwin's resting place. He described the silence as overwhelming, not empty, but full, like the pause between heartbeats. He wrote that as he stood there, he realized Baldwin's story was not about leprosy or even kingship. It was about endurance without reward, faith without certainty. He ruled for 11 years. The historian wrote, "But he will reign for eternity. Because time cannot erode what he made, sacred the courage to continue." Outside that church, the city had changed beyond recognition. Automobiles replaced horses, and the call to prayer mingled with the tolling of church bells in the smoky air of a modern metropolis. Yet even amid the noise, there were moments of quiet where history seemed to breathe again. A street vendor, setting down his cart near the old walls, might glance toward the horizon and feel an inexplicable shiver, as though someone unseen were watching. A child lighting a candle in the church might swear she heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. And those who lived long enough in the city learned that it was better not to dismiss such things. Jerusalem, after all, remembers. The legend continued to evolve in ways no scholar could predict. In poems and novels, Baldwin appeared as a voice rather than a figure, the whisper that told the weary not to give up, the quiet reminder that strength need not roar. He became a metaphor for anyone who lived with hidden suffering, a patron saint for the broken yet unbowed. And in that way, he became more alive than any marble statue or gilded relic could ever be. For stories are living things, and his story, born from rot and agony, had become a seed of endurance planted in the hearts of those who came after. Some evenings, when the desert wind sweeps over the city and the bells of the Holy Sepulchre toll for vespers, it is said that the scent of myrrh drifts through the narrow alleys, faint but unmistakable, mingling with the dust and the echo of prayers. The locals smile and say softly, "The king walks tonight." They say it not with fear, but with affection, as though speaking of an old friend who has never truly left. And perhaps, in a way, he has not. For the courage of Baldwin the Fourth, once confined to the frail shell of a rotting body, has become something far larger, a quiet pulse that beats within every act of mercy, every whisper of perseverance, every heart that chooses endurance over surrender. And so the story endures, reshaped yet eternal, told not in the clash of swords, but in the silence that follows pain. The Leper King who once ruled Jerusalem has become a legend beyond kingship, a truth beyond time. His city may crumble and rise again. His throne may have turned to dust, but his spirit still walks among the living, teaching through its stillness the oldest lesson of all, that death may conquer the body, but never the will. And when night falls over the ancient city, and the last bell fades into the distance, the stones themselves seem to whisper his name, not with sorrow but with reverence, as if the land that once held him still knows the weight of a courage that refused to die. And so, the centuries rolled forward like slow waves upon an ancient shore, erasing armies and kings, but never quite washing away the trace of Baldwin's memory. Time did what it always does. It changed everything except the things it could not touch. The stones of Jerusalem darkened. The languages of prayer shifted from Latin to Arabic to Hebrew to 100 other tongues. And the world beyond its gates grew faster, louder, and more distant. Yet within those walls, where dawn still struck gold against the domes, and the air still carried the mingled smoke of candles and dust, there lingered the ghost of the boy who had once ruled a kingdom while his own flesh betrayed him. It was not a haunting of sorrow, but of endurance a quiet persistence, as if his will had seeped into the very foundation of the city and refused to leave. There are travelers even today who claim that Jerusalem has a certain silence, unlike any other city on earth. It is not the silence of emptiness, but of remembrance, the hush of a place that has seen too much, a place that carries the breath of every soul that ever wept or prayed within its walls. And though most who walk its streets do not know his name, that silence belongs to Baldwin as much as to prophets and saints. It is his gift to the city, a kind of peace that can exist only after long suffering, the peace of someone who has already faced death and found no fear in it. The story of the Leper King has long since passed beyond history. It has become an echo, a pulse that rises when courage is needed, a whisper carried by the wind that moves through the narrow streets at dusk. In some forgotten corner of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the marble floor dips with age and the scent of oil never fades, pilgrims sometimes pause without knowing why. They light a candle, not for a reason they can name, but because the air feels expectant, as if something unseen listens. And in that moment of stillness, between flame and shadow, they feel it not the presence of a ghost, but the nearness of endurance itself. For Baldwin's story is not about the miracles of heaven, but the small, relentless miracle of persistence. It is not about the conquest of empires, but the quiet mastery of the self. Even the skeptics, those who dismiss saints and legends alike, cannot deny the strange pull of his memory. Historians return to his reign again and again, drawn not by the wars he fought, but by the riddle of how he endured them. How did a young man, blind and half decayed, hold a kingdom together through sheer force of will? How did he rule without bitterness? When pain followed him like a shadow, they call it resilience. They call it faith. They call it leadership. But none of those words feel large enough. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the space between them, in that wordless territory where suffering and purpose intertwine. When the modern world began to measure time by machines instead of seasons, and the old faiths fractured into doubts, Baldwin's story might have faded like smoke. Yet somehow, it survived, reshaped, reinterpreted, but never erased. In cathedrals rebuilt after war, his name was sometimes carved into small plaques, not as a king, but as a symbol. In novels and poems, he appeared not as a figure of pity, but as one of grace, the man who ruled while falling apart, the heart that kept beating after the flesh had given up. Artists of the 20th century painted him, not in gold, but in shades of grey and blue, his eyes calm and endless. They saw in him not religion, but humanity, the eternal struggle of spirit against matter, of dignity against despair. In our own age, where people speak often of strength, yet hide their pain behind glowing screens, the Leper King's story feels strangely new again. It speaks softly to those who wake in the dark, carrying silent battles no one else can see. It reminds them that brokenness is not weakness, that to endure is itself a form of power. His courage was not loud or shining, it was slow and deliberate, like breath drawn against pain, like light rising over the desert after a sleepless night. He ruled not by denying his suffering, but by transforming it into purpose, and in that, he became more than a monarch. He became the embodiment of quiet defiance. There are scholars today who call him a paradox, a man both doomed and victorious, both decaying and divine. But Baldwin's power lies precisely in that contradiction. For every life contains its own version of his kingdom, a place we must govern while something within us falters. Whether it be the body, the heart, or the dream we once held, he teaches, across the distance of 800 years, that the throne of the soul does not crumble, even when flesh and fortune do. He reminds us that endurance is not about winning, but about staying true, about holding the line within ourselves, even when the world falls apart outside. And perhaps that is why his story still breathes in Jerusalem, for the city itself mirrors his life, sacred and wounded, unkillable and endlessly reborn. It has burned. It has fallen. It has been rebuilt so many times that no one can count. Yet it endures. Like Baldwin, it suffers and it survives. To walk its streets at dawn, when the light touches the old stones and the air hums with prayers of 100 faiths, is to feel the same fragile, unyielding hope that once kept a dying king alive. The city, in its way, has become his body scarred, divided, butte enduring. Sometimes, when the bells of the sepulchre toll for evening service, the sound rolls over the rooftops and echoes through the valleys beyond. The monks say the last bell is always slightly out of tune, its tone deeper than the rest, as if mourning something it cannot name. They call it the king's note. They say it carries his memory across the night sky, reminding the city of its oldest truth, that pain and holiness often wear the same face. And though the faithful come and go, though nations rise and vanish, that note never fails to sound. It is the heartbeat of endurance itself. And so, the story ends where it began, in a land of dust and light, where faith is tested and hope reborn in every generation. The Leper King, Baldwin the Fourth of Jerusalem, has long since turned to ash, but his will remains. It lives in every act of courage that asks for nothing in return, in every quiet soul who bears their suffering with dignity, in every heart that refuses to surrender to the cruelty of time. He reminds us that death does not end a story. It only changes its voice. His, perhaps, is the gentlest of all the voice that whispers not of triumph, but of endurance, not of conquest, but of compassion. So if you ever stand within that ancient city and feel the wind shift, if you catch the faint scent of myrrh or hear a bell toll low in the distance, do not be afraid. It is only the memory of a king who never left, walking unseen among the living, guarding a city that still remembers his pain, his courage, and his quiet defiance. For Baldwin the Fourth, the Leper King who ruled while dying, still reigns not from a throne of gold, but from the hearts of those who endure. And as long as there is suffering met with grace, as long as there is courage without hope of reward, his kingdom invisible and eternal shall never fall.